and then upload. Sweet. All right. So, so like I said, let's just get this started here. Good evening, all, and thank you for coming and being participants in this webinar. I want to first start by saying that this webinar was made possible by a grant-funded program through the USDA. This is the Beginner Farmer Rancher program in partnership with the Pocasset Land Trust and NOFA Mass. This will also serve as a primer to a workshop happening also at the end of the month, April 27th, for a hands-on workshop on compost teas. So here we go. So there's going to be three major concepts that we're going to be covering today. This is going to be an introductory to compost teas. And what we're going to do here is three concepts. First, we're going to try to define what compost tea is. We're going to be specifically talking about one specific type of compost tea, and we'll get into that in a little bit. We're also going to be looking at some of the benefits of compost tea and, why should you be doing compost teas? And also important considerations when starting to get into compost tea brewing. So let's get this started here and talk about what compost tea is. I have the slide here, and the reason why I have this here and defining compost is because your compost tea is defined really by the starting material. So before we actually get into talking about compost teas, we have to talk about our compost. And while there's many types of compost out there between thermophilic or static aerated, and among other composting systems, or vermicasting that could be considered a type of compost. For the most part, when we're talking about compost, in my view, we're talking about a biological inoculum. After all, these are actually all biology that are responsible for breaking down this material, this organic matter, or decomposing it rather. And they're the principal drivers of this. And so whenever I use compost, I'm thinking of compost as a biological inoculum that I'm bringing in a number of different organisms and trying to bring the most diverse number of microorganisms to. Along with that, there are biochemical properties in this, and these are all produced by the same microbes that are actually responsible for breaking down the material. And so, these biochemical properties include hormone-like chemicals. They include chemical signals. They include enzymes, all of which are important for our purposes in agriculture. Of course, then there's the organic matter that the compost is bringing as well. This organic matter is obviously the driver of all this. It sustains the life in the compost itself. And there's obviously some fertility as well, which you can obviously test for. So if we take these components of compost and hope to actually extract what we have from the compost, we have a compost tea, which is the expansion of all of these properties that we actually have here, specifically the biochemical properties, which are just will be expanded, and the biological activity will also be expanded. We will be specifically speaking about actively aerated compost tea, which is tea that you are actually using any type of compost, but we want the most biological, active, and diverse compost, and putting it in a brewer with water and giving it a food source to expand what's there already. So compost tea explained, all in a nutshell. So down to the next topic here, or concept that we actually will be discussing tonight, are the reasons why we would probably want to be using this compost tea. We have four here that we'll be highlighting. One of them is plant growth, disease suppression, photosynthesis. We're going to be talking about how compost teas are able to aid plants in photosynthesizing to their genetic potential. And also plant available nutrients, as discussed too, that these are also part of what the compost itself is bringing. So first off, I have a slide here on Dr. Johnson. This is one of his presentations, and I actually have borrowed a lot of his material for this specific talk. This one in particular is actually showing the interactions between or expected plant growth, and that nutrition alone or minerals and fertilizers alone are not a good predictor of plant growth. However, what the study did conclude was that this fungal to bacterial ratio could be used as a proxy to determine plant growth. This is specific to soils that are biologically enhanced, but one can actually correlate that these compost teas can actually have these properties or provide the properties to the soil by bringing in this inoculum into the soil, thus changing that fungal to bacterial ratio. So if you actually have, if you are successful at making really good compost teas, you can in fact actually change this fungal to bacterial ratio in your soil and on your plants, thus providing, vigorous plant growth. The next thing is, and this is very, very important, especially for us here in the Northeast, that, especially when it comes to the, late in the season when we're getting enormous amounts of rain and specific crops too, this right here is a gray mold. I'm sure that most of you have seen these. These attack strawberries, grapes, and a number of other products that we actually grow. And it's one of the biggest issues in terms of diseases in agriculture. I believe it's responsible for over $10 billion of losses annually. So this actually, again, it's a gray mold, and this is just a microscopic picture of what this looks like. Now, what I want to bring here is a study that Dr. Elaine Ingham did on a winery or a vineyard, sorry. Right, they were making wines with the grapes. So what they did in this study is that they actually took a few blocks where they actually purposely infected these plants with this mold at different concentrations. The reason why they did this was to determine the type of coverage that you would need of compost teas in order to actually provide enough protection for the plant so that it actually can fight off this gray mold. So through that process, it was determined, and I may have to backtrack a bit here. When Dr. Elaine talks about the type of compost and compost teas, there's a trademark that is typically used in the Soil Food Web School, and that is that the compost and compost teas have to be biocomplete. And all that means is that they've determined that there's a number of diverse microorganisms that must exist in that compost and subsequently in the compost tea in order to consider it biocomplete. So it's important to preface that not all compost will actually have any of these properties that we're talking about here, and we'll talk a little bit more about quality control in a bit. But it's important to preface that as well, that when this study was done, they had to meet minimum requirement of specific microbes in different levels as well, and diversity. And so it was determined that about 70% of leaf coverage was needed to provide adequate protection against this particular disease, if you will. I believe that they actually fixed the problem after with additional compost teas and the other blocks. But again, this is actually a great reason why you would actually want to be making great compost teas. It's for this disease suppression. And this is basically, you spray your compost tea on your plant. You have at least 70% coverage of this compost tea. And what the tea does is that it actually provides a layer of protection, a literal layer of protection, where if any of these spores were to try to attach to the surfaces of the plant, they could not get there because there's all this competition inhibiting their disease-causing action. So another reason why important to make your own compost teas. Here's another slide from Dr. David Johnson, and this is an interesting slide here. We have talked a lot at NOFA about, carbon drawdown, about, plants photosynthesizing to their max genetic potential. And we've talked about the importance of that, both in the reason why plants even do this in the first place, and it's to actually really feed the microbiome that's in the soil, but also feeding this microbiome, with these root exudates. They're also allowing some of these processes, such as the rhizophagy cycle, to occur as well. So in this slide, all we're seeing here is that in this study where they took a few plants, I believe they were chili plants, they measured the total carbon flow into the soils. And so about 70% of this total carbon flow existed or was fixed into the soil in this biologically enhanced system. So again, another reason why we would want our plants to, again, photosynthesize to their max genetic potential, is that they will be drawing down more carbon, feeding the microbiome, and just creating a better habitat and building soil, really, because this is the reason why you would actually want to have your plants photosynthesize, is that they can actually increase the organic matter in your soil too. And lastly, we actually have, another added bonus to having these biologically enhanced systems, and one of them being compost tea as part of this management, is the increase in nutrition in form of, of these elements. This study, again, was a 20-month study, 5 sampling periods, where they actually took samples throughout the study. And you can see at the top there where you have 0, which is your baseline, 6 months, 8 months, 15 months, and 19 months. And you can see that there actually was an increase in all of these elements, throughout the entire study. And this is really important because when we're talking about, that this could have huge implications. This can save you money. You don't have to add that much, that many, the amount of fertilizers that you were perhaps adding before. This is creating a higher nutrient density in your plants as well, because they actually have the nutrients that they need, and then us consuming them, we actually benefit from these nutrients as well. So again, another reason why you would actually want to be including a biological system into your management, and compost tea being one of those. So I'm moving pretty quickly here, and I wanted to move quickly to actually give us enough time to actually have more discussions. However, I would like to, at this moment, pause and field any questions if we have any. And if we don't, that's great too. We can continue here. All right, so um, important considerations before you get started with this. I've highlighted a few of these here. These include the quality control. You know, how do you know that you're actually making good compost tea? Some recipes. I'm not going to get into specifics about recipes, but we will touch upon some ingredients. We'll talk a little bit about spray equipment, how to brew these things, and also, very, very importantly, the water quality that you're going to be using to develop these teas too. So the first thing that we're going to talk about quality control. So how do you know when you've actually made good compost? You know, compost, when you start the brewing process, you are actively aerating your compost tea rather. You know, you've added your water, you've added your foods, and you start the brewing process. Now, when do you know you're done with this? And so, quite frankly, the only way you will know that your brew is complete or it is good enough for you to use is by using a microscope. And before you even start to actually do this brewing process, you want to make sure that your compost is biologically active to begin with before you start making a tea. Because if you don't have the diversity in your compost to begin with, it's not going to magically appear in your compost tea. And this goes back to us as a community here trying to define what good compost is. Unfortunately, any commercial compost that is provided, for the most part, and I wish to see this differently, do not offer a biological assessment. And so when you're purchasing your compost, and unless you actually have a microscope, you don't know what you're really getting out of your compost. That is also true if you're making your own compost as well. You don't know what you have there until you actually start doing testing. I'm not sure why more microbial testing is not done on compost. I think it's very important. It's probably the most important part of compost. And so as we continue going through these processes, we're trying to develop ways to train folks on how to use microscopes. Check out our website. Actually, we have a few classes going on already. I believe they're full now for the spring, but we may actually start another either summer or fall. But we want more people to actually able to use these tools, and also try to change the landscape so that when we're purchasing compost, now these composters are saying, well, wait a second, I have to actually make sure that I'm making biologically active and diverse compost. And we all benefit from that. So having a microscope is an essential tool when making compost teas. And so here is an example of this, where we actually have a compost tea that John Duke was actually brewing. And this first slide is at 40 hours. And he probably could have stopped there, based on how it was to begin with. But it kept on going into 72 hours. And here you can see even somebody that is not trained in microscopy can clearly see that there's actually an increase in biomass here. There's an increase in humic substances. There's more, just in general, more biomass here. So The only way anybody can actually determine this is, again, going back to the microscope and saying, yeah, I actually have more diversity and I have all these different things that weren't there before. Um, the training that would be necessary comes later on to actually identify what you're seeing. But for the layperson or for somebody that's getting started with this, I think it's easy enough to just say, well, there's more than it was there before. And sometimes that could be beneficial, just actually knowing that you actually have more of this biomass present. Okay, so now for tea, for recipes. So, like I said, I am not going to give you specific recipes. And the reason for that is because I rather tell folks what is needed, what you're bringing to the table, and you make your own experimentation. And so on the left side here, I do have some microbial foods um, that you can take. You can add those. However, the most important thing here is recognizing the immense diversity that exists or should exist in our compost. As you can see on this on the metagenomic data that you see on this chart here, um, there's a lot of microbes out there, right? And so whenever we're actually providing foods and making teas, you have to consider who you're trying to feed, who you're trying to bring to the table. Because there's a lot of these microorganisms that you want diversity. So what are the things that could be affecting your teas? Who are you favoring? And so I have listed a few things here of what microbes need to grow, right? So first thing, they need a favorable environment, which means that there's a number of microbes that prefer a certain pH, others that prefer a certain temperature. And then there's redox conditions as well. So these are all things that microbes will need in terms of their general environment in order to replicate, right? Next, we have water. Not all water is created equal. You can be using spring water, you can be using tap water, which I don't recommend using tap water only because it's highly chlorinated. If you do know if your water department is chlorinating, you can actually just aerate the water for 24 hours, or you can actually complex the chlorine or chloramine, which chloramine does not evaporate. So if you actually do have chloramine, you can actually use instead you can use some humic acid, enough humic acid to change the water color that will complex out that chlorine. Whatever water you decide to use, it's important to perhaps get a baseline of your water. Whether it's putting it on the microscope and do you already have something growing in there? Because if you do, then the water conditions are already going to favor whatever's in there to begin with. So if you start with a clean slate, you know that you're actually going to be bringing in the microbes that you want from your compost instead of something that's coming from your water. Next, we actually have, and we'll talk a little bit more about water in a second. Next, we have mineral nutrients. This is actually, I forget the word in English here, but I believe it's a mnemonic way of remembering this. So Seep Hopkins Cafe is mighty good. It goes. C being the carbon, H hydrogen, O your oxygen, phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen, sulfur, calcium, and iron. These are the mineral nutrients that all microbes need to actually replicate, survive, and thrive. So having these are extremely important. So these are specifically important when you're providing your food sources. So consider these nutrients, their concentrations, and the form that they're in whenever you're providing foods to your compost tea. Obviously, they also need energy sources. Very often, but not always, organic carbon. Um, and these can be, again, provided in different ways when you're actually giving them certain foods. Electron donors and acceptors goes back to the whole redox conditions. Redox is simply a state where it's either oxidizing or reducing the environment, basically accepting or donating electrons. And then there's going to be other growth factors that are necessary for not all microbes will need some of these growth factors, but some of them do need growth factors. And again, this goes back to, who do I want to replicate, and how do I dial in my recipe so that when I'm considering all of these different conditions, if I add more of certain growth factors, will I benefit, or favor one microbe versus another? And these are all things that you must consider when developing your recipe. So those 6 things should be considered. And just to touch upon a little bit about the recipes that are here on the left-hand side. Um, each of these actually do select for certain microbes, for example, simple sugars, your bacteria will be all over that. Bacteria typically just make one type of enzyme, and they're really good at digesting those simple sugars. Whereas in fungi can produce multiple enzymes, but they like to go for the more complex materials, either carbs or even sugars as well. Another thing that I want to highlight here are spices. You can actually also, by providing some of these different spices, if you will, select for certain microbes that you don't want in your environment. So these are all things that you should consider when developing your recipe, and I hope it gets the juices flowing for all of you. Next, we have our spray equipment. And I know that John Duke that is going to be leading the Compost Tea workshop on April 27th, often talks about trying to work backwards, that, your spray equipment eventually will be the most important part of this, because if you actually had a great compost and great compost tea, and you all of a sudden killed everything in the process and your spray equipment, then there goes. So a few things to consider when you're looking at spray equipment. A lot of people talk about the pressure that these are exerting, but pressure is not that important. What is important is that whenever you're spraying this, first of all, that you have a big enough aperture. So whenever you have your spray equipment, these are going to be coming in different sizes, patterns, and materials, from metals, plastics, and so on. And so whatever you decide in terms of the different nozzle sizes, make sure that it's the same aperture as your tea bag. If you're not using a tea bag, whatever you're using to filter that out. So whatever you're using, whether it's a tea bag or a mesh, whatever you're using to filter that out, make sure that the nozzle is about the same size. That way you can actually maximize whoever you're bringing through your tea is also going out. Another way to look at this too is to do some type of quality control, right? You can start by, you already looked at your compost tea when it's finished through your microscope. Go ahead and actually look at it at the other end after you have sprayed, spray into a cup or something. And, are you getting things that are smashed all into bits and pieces? Or are you getting what you saw exactly on the other end? And that's another good way of actually evaluating whether or not your spray equipment is actually working. Um, Again, water pressure it's more important than or water pressure, it depends on, or the pressure inside of the spray equipment itself. It's where it comes in, where it's important is when you're actually trying to spray tall trees. And you may actually need more pressure for when you're doing these types of sprays if you're doing trees. But again, more importantly, anything else, try not to spray things directly so that they're smashing against these surfaces, because that's actually when you start killing these microbes. And lastly here, this is a little bit of some homework if people want to actually experiment a little more with magnetism. I know of some folks that have modified their spray equipment with magnets. The reason why you would want to do that is because if you change the polarity rather the charge of your water, it can help adhere to some of these surfaces that we're trying to get onto. That may or may not be necessary, depending on how good that microbial tea went. Because the idea is that after you have brewed for a certain amount of time, both bacteria and fungi start to create microbial glues. These microbial glues will help and adhere to some of the surfaces of your plants too. So that is to be determined, but I know that some people have used magnets to change that polarity in the water for better adherence. All right, so next we have our brewing equipment. So the brewing equipment can be as complicated and as expensive as you want it to be, or it can be really cheap. So here I have two contrasting brewers, if you will. The one on the left is a very typical conical brewer that has air coming from below and above, so you can actually have a lift as well. Although sometimes you don't have that lift there for water, and it's just air coming from below, excuse me. And those come in different sizes, different price points as well. Things to consider is that the larger the brewer, the larger your pump has to be in order to actually get oxygen throughout the entire vessel and keep it oxygenated through the entire process as well. So those are some of the things that you have to consider because you're having to bring all that air through the entire column. So something to consider when you're actually looking into equipment. The one on the right, and the folks that actually participate in the workshop will be able to provide them with specific the specs on how to build it. I believe everything pump included comes up to a little over $100. And that is something that John Duke modified from Tim Wilson, and I'll give you some links at the end of this too, so you can do a little homework as well. But what it is it actually has an airlift, so you can actually bring air from above and structure your water. Another further modification that you can make when structuring this water is perhaps actually just adding certain stones or something like that into the airlift too, to actually better structure your water. And also blows from below as well. So again, these are just two examples, but I also want to say that you can make these brewers out of anything that you have around, as long as you're able to properly clean them. I think the most important part is actually taking these things apart and cleaning all the different parts. If you don't do that, remember that you're brewing and you're cultivating microbes, and they like to form films. So if you're not cleaning them right away, they'll form a film, and you'll end up actually brewing some nasty stuff later on. So I think the most important thing when you're considering this are the pump size, the size of your relative to your brewer, and also a brewer that can easily be disassembled so you can actually clean it properly. Um, uh, a tip for those that are actually encountering some biofilms that either in here or in other instances where you're storing water, these biofilms cannot be easily cleaned off with bleach alone. And something that I learned in a trick in the water industry is that you have to lower the pH of the biofilm in order to actually attack it later on with bleach. So if you do actually end up with a case where you're seeing these slimy biofilms forming, lower the pH. The safest thing to use is acetic acid vinegar. Lower the pH, and then hit it with some bleach, and that should resolve that. But again, something easy to clean. It's my major recommendation on this. So finally, we actually have water quality. Water quality is extremely important, because if you remember the slide back on what microbes need, your water is actually going to have most of these properties already present. So that water may actually have its own pH. It may have its own slew of elements in there, and so if you're on well water, periodically testing your well water would be nice to know. Okay, well, do I have I don't know, certain levels of nitrates, or am I bringing, microbes already in this? And even if you're actually on town water, not everything is filtered out. And so periodically checking your water and seeing, and just even having a baseline, sending it out to a lab and saying, I want a water quality drinking water assessment. And most labs that are certified will know that. Um, and and this is again really important if you actually want to be making good quality teas that you're eventually going to be putting on your food. So consider water quality, consider testing with an approved accredited lab that can do these things. And I think you'll be on your way to creating some really awesome teas. And with that, I want to leave you all with some of these resources here. I'll explain some of these resources, and I can email them after this as well if it's easier. The first link here is from Regen Ag. This, I believe, is from John Kemp's website, where there's a bunch of courses. Some of them are free, others are there's a fee for them. The very first one here is on redox. So if people want to learn more about redox potential and EH, there's a free course in there that you can take, and it's very enlightening. The second one there is the microbe organics there. I spoke about Tim Wilson. Tim Wilson is a great resource, and his website also has a lot of recipes that you can follow. There's ways to actually build some of these things that you will need. And also a good library to identify things as well. So again, great resource there. The next one there is the DEP actually has a website where you can select a specific parameter that you're willing to test, and going through their database will show you all the different labs that are accredited or certified for that particular parameter that you're trying to analyze. That's not the only way to look for this, but if you do find a lab that you actually like to use, you can certainly try to find out whether they're accredited or not. A few accreditations that you will see around here are probably NELAC, which is accreditation from New York. ISO is probably a higher standard accreditation, and ASTM is another one, but ASTM is typically reserved for specialty testing, which probably won't apply to the stuff that we're looking for. And then we actually have the Soil Food Web. All of this information that I'm bringing you today, I, for the most part, learned through the Soil Food Web as a certified lab tech. We're taught how to use a microscope, how to identify microbes, and also how to make compost teas and extracts. So that's an excellent resource there. However, there's a significant cost to that. I also put down here a YouTube video. This YouTube video was from, I believe, our 2021 summer conference, where we invited Gerald Pollack to talk about the fourth phase of water. When we're looking at providing these conditions for these microbes, having an understanding of this exclusion zone, an easy fourth phase of water, could be very beneficial, but also, again, this gets into more heady stuff. There's also a few books from Gerald Pollard that are great. I believe one is Cells, Gels, and something like that, but you can research that. And then finally, I do want to put in a plug for our events this year. We have a ton of events happening this year. Again, we have a few out of this USDA PPLT partnership that we're doing tonight. Those are going to be 3 events held at 2 different farms, one at Farming is Life in Winchendon, another one at Woven Roots in Tyringham. And they're going to be focusing on 3 aspects of soil, or the 3 pillars of soil health, which we have identified as the biological, chemical, and physical attributes. And those will be full-day workshops where we can actually interact with the farmer, the soil, and be in community as well. And lastly, there's also that link can bring you also to the workshop that's happening at the end of the month if you want to geek out more about compost teas. So with that, we are done here. And